I used to think I knew every sound in Frost Hollow County. Not just the big ones, not the obvious ones. I mean the small, ordinary noises you stop noticing after a few years on patrol. The way gravel shifts under tires when you pull off too fast. The way pine needles hiss when the wind changes direction. The distant, tired bark of a dog that has nothing to bark at except loneliness. I knew those sounds the way you know your own breathing. And then, one night, I heard knocking. Not on a door, not on a window, not on the hood of my cruiser when some drunk decided it was funny. Knocking from the trees. Before we go any further, I need you to do something for me. If you like slow burn stories that get under your skin and stay there, hit subscribe right now. Not later. Right now. Because the people who clicked away early, they always told me they wish they hadn't. And I don't say that for drama. I say it because this is the kind of story that waits for you to stop listening. And while you're here, tell me in the comments where you're watching from. City, town, country, doesn't matter. I just want to know how far the sound can travel. Because I swear to you, it doesn't care about distance. It starts like a simple thing. A single knock, somewhere in the dark. You assume it's a branch, or a deer, or the woods settling the way woods do when the temperature drops. You laugh at yourself even. You settle back into your uniform. You turn the heater up. You let the radio chatter wash over you like a lullaby. But that's only if you're lucky. I wasn't lucky. It happened on a stretch of county road that doesn't even have a proper name. Just a number locals barely bother to remember. A 2-lane thread of cracked asphalt cutting through miles of pine and spruce. No streetlights. No houses for long, long stretches. Just trees. Just black trunks. Just the kind of dark that feels thick enough to lean against. I was alone, like always. Deputies in Frost Hollow cover too much ground with too few bodies. You get used to it. You learn to talk to your own thoughts. You learn to check your mirrors even when there's nobody behind you. You learn that silence out here isn't peaceful. It's watchful. I'd pulled off the road at a turnout I'd used 100 times. A place where the trees opened just enough to show a slice of sky and a ditch full of dead leaves. I was finishing paperwork. Half the job is paperwork, and the other half is pretending it isn't. My pen stopped moving when I heard it. One knock. Clear, dry, like knuckles on wood. My first thought was someone messing with me. A hunter. A bored teenager. A local who wanted to see if the deputy would come running. So I got out. You should understand something about that moment. There was no fear yet. Not the kind you're imagining. Not the heart-hammering kind. Not the cold sweat kind. It was just annoyance, routine, the little irritation of being interrupted. I left the cruiser door open behind me, engine running. The headlights shone straight into the trees, turning the nearest trunks pale and flat, like stage props. I stood there with my flashlight in my hand and listened. Silence, no footsteps, no laughter, no rustle of someone hiding. Then another knock. This time, deeper in the woods. To my left, I swung my light that way, expecting to catch the shine of an eye, the flash of reflective tape, the pale face of somebody about to regret a stupid prank. Nothing. I walked a few steps off the pavement. My boots sank into damp earth and needles. The air was sharp and wet, like it had teeth. And then, behind me, another knock. Right where I'd just been looking. That was when my annoyance thinned out, and something else slipped in underneath it. The sound wasn't random. It wasn't a branch falling. It wasn't an animal. It was measured, like it had a mind behind it. I remember thinking, absurdly, that it sounded polite, like someone waiting to be invited in. Not real. Real. Not real. I told myself it was echoes. Sound does strange things in thick woods, especially at night. You hear something from one direction and it bounces, turns around, comes back from another. So I did what deputies do when they don't want to admit they're unsettled. I spoke like I was in control. "Sheriff's Department," I called out. "Whoever's out there, you need to make yourself known." My voice sounded wrong. Too loud, like it didn't belong in the air. No answer, just the soft hum of my cruiser engine and the faint radio static from inside the cab. Then the knocking came again. Not once, twice. 2 knocks, spaced evenly, like someone had decided one wasn't enough. And it was closer. I backed up toward the road without meaning to. My hand tightened on the flashlight until my fingers hurt. I told myself again that it was nothing. That's the thing about fear. It doesn't arrive as fear. It arrives as a story you tell yourself. A story where everything is normal. A story where you're the kind of person nothing happens to. I was still telling myself that story when I heard it for the 4th time. Only this time it wasn't deeper in the woods. It was right beside the cruiser. I turned so fast the beam of my flashlight jerked across the trunks like a panicked searchlight. The knocking had come from the tree closest to my open driver's door. A tall pine, straight as a pole, bark rough and dark. I stepped toward it. I don't know why. Maybe because it's easier to move forward than to admit you want to run. The tree was just a tree. No one behind it. No one in front of it. No movement, no shape, no face. Just bark. And yet, as I watched, a final knock sounded from somewhere higher up the trunk. Not loud. Not violent. Just deliberate. Like a signal. I stood there so long my breath started to fog the air. I listened so hard I could hear my own pulse in my ears. Then, from deeper in the woods, far past the reach of my headlights, something answered. A knock. Then another. Then another. It wasn't one thing out there. It was many. Not real. Real, not real. I got back in the cruiser. I shut the door. I locked it, even though that's ridiculous out there. I told myself the lock was for people, and trees aren't people, and that thought should have calmed me. It didn't. Because as soon as I sat down and the cab sealed around me, the sound changed. The knocking didn't stop. It shifted. It spread out. It came from the left, the right, the rear quarter, the trunk area, the roof. Once, soft but unmistakable. Like someone testing the boundaries of the car, like someone learning. My radio crackled with nothing but static. No dispatcher voice. No other units. Just a low, dirty hiss that rose and fell like breathing. I started the cruiser moving before I even decided to. Tires rolled over gravel. Headlights swept forward. Trees blurred past. And the knocking followed. Not behind me. Not fading away. Not growing distant. Following like it was keeping pace on both sides of the road. Unseen between the trunks. Tapping and tapping and tapping as though it was counting my speed. I remember one thought, clear as a road sign. If I stop again, it will be right there waiting. So I didn't stop. I drove all the way back to town with my jaw clenched so tight my teeth ached. When I got home, I sat in my driveway with the engine off, hands still on the steering wheel, listening. Nothing. Just the ticking of cooling metal. Just my own breath, loud in the cab. I told myself I'd imagined it. I told myself the woods had played tricks. I told myself the county was getting to my head. That too much night and too much solitude makes you hear patterns where there aren't any. Not real. Real. Not real. Then I stepped out of the cruiser, and somewhere across the yard, beyond the porch light, from the line of trees at the edge of my property, there came a single, soft knock. Not on a door. Not on a wall. From the trees. I didn't file a report that night. That's the first thing you should understand if you're trying to decide whether to believe me. There are rules about that sort of thing. If you hear something unusual on patrol, you write it down. If there's a disturbance, you log it. If you think someone might be in danger, you call it in. Paperwork is how the job protects itself. Paperwork is how things become real. And I did not want this to be real. I stood in my driveway longer than I should have, staring at the dark line of trees that marked the edge of my land. The porch light only reached so far. Beyond it, the forest began abruptly, like a curtain pulled tight. Black trunks. No wind. No insects. No movement I could see. I waited for another knock. It didn't come. That almost made it worse. Inside the house, everything felt too loud. The click of the deadbolt. The hum of the refrigerator. My boots against the floor. Sounds I'd lived with for years suddenly felt like they were announcing my position. I didn't sleep much. When I did, I dreamed of counting. Knocks instead of numbers. Always losing track. Always starting over. By morning, daylight had smoothed the edges of the memory just enough for doubt to slip in. Sunlight through the kitchen window. Steam rising from a mug of coffee. The normal weight of a badge clipped to my belt as I got dressed. Not real. Real. Not real. I told myself I'd imagined it. Stress. Fatigue. The kind of thing deputies don't talk about because they don't want to sound weak or stupid. Frost Hollow County has a way of stretching your nerves thin without you noticing. Still, I drove to work with the radio on louder than usual. The station was quiet when I arrived. 2 desks occupied. 1 empty. The sheriff hadn't come in yet. No one mentioned anything unusual from the night before. No calls logged. No complaints. No reports of trespassers or strange activity along County Road 12. I almost relaxed. Then the missing persons call came in. Middle of the morning. Clear voice. Calm tone. A woman reporting her husband overdue from a walk he took the night before. Name I recognized. Local. Late 40s. Quiet guy. Kept to himself but showed up when people needed help fixing fences or clearing storm damage. Last seen heading toward the logging trails north of town. Toward the same stretch of woods. I volunteered to take it before anyone else could. That should have been my first clue that something was already wrong. By the time I reached the trailhead, the day had gone dull and gray. Clouds hung low, flattening the light. The forest looked different in daylight, but not better. Just more exposed. The trees stood close together, their trunks scarred with old marks from logging equipment and storms, and things I didn't want to think too hard about. I parked and stepped out, letting the door shut quietly behind me this time. The air smelled damp, earthy, rotting leaves and pine sap. Somewhere far off, a bird called once and then went silent. I called the man's name, standard procedure. Loud enough to carry, not loud enough to sound panicked. Nothing answered. I followed the trail in, boots pressing into mud that still held the shape of yesterday's rain. There were footprints. Normal ones. Human ones. Heading deeper into the woods. I crouched to look at them, fingers brushing the edge of a print where the soil had collapsed inward. They stopped abruptly. No sign of a struggle. No signs leading off the trail. Just gone. I straightened and listened. The woods had a way of swallowing sound when they wanted to. You don't realize how much background noise you expect until it disappears. No wind through branches. No insects. Just a stillness that pressed in around my ears. That was when I noticed the marks on the trees. At first I thought they were old damage, scars from equipment or animals. But the closer I looked, the less they made sense. Indentations at chest height, some higher, some lower, always rounded, always clean-edged, like something had struck the trunks repeatedly in the same spot. I reached out and touched one. The bark was rough, flaking under my fingers. The wood beneath felt solid, unbroken. A memory surfaced uninvited. The sound of that knock beside my cruiser. I pulled my hand back. Not real. Real. Not real. I moved deeper into the woods, calling out again. I told myself I was looking for a missing man. I told myself the night before had nothing to do with this. I told myself stories the way you do when the alternative feels dangerous. The trail narrowed. Trees closed in. Light dimmed under the canopy. Then I heard it. One knock. It came from ahead of me this time. Far enough away that I could pretend it was something else if I wanted to. A branch snapping, a bird striking bark, the forest settling. I waited. Nothing. I took another step forward. Another knock answered immediately. Same tone, same hollow sound. I turned slowly, scanning with my eyes instead of my flashlight. Daylight should have made this easier. It didn't. Shadows clung to the spaces between trunks, thick and stubborn. I spoke again, my voice sounding smaller than I wanted it to. If someone's out there, I said, make yourself known. Silence. Then, to my right, a knock. Closer. I felt the space around me change. Not visibly, not in a way I could point to, just a sense of adjustment, like the woods were shifting their weight. I backed up a step without realizing it. The knock came again, this time from behind me. I spun, heart hammering now, and there was still nothing there. Just trees. Just bark. Just the same quiet, watching forest. I stood there longer than was reasonable, turning in a slow circle, trying to reconcile what I was hearing with what I was seeing. That was when I noticed something else. The marks on the trees weren't random. They formed a rough ring around the clearing I'd wandered into. I felt very small all at once. Not real. Real. Not real. I told myself the sound was echoing. I told myself I was tired. I told myself anything that kept me from saying the other thing out loud, that the woods were answering me. I raised my radio and called for an update. The static crackled, thin and uneven, but the dispatcher answered. Her voice sounded far away, like it was coming through water. I gave my location. I reported the missing person's trail going cold. I did not mention the knocking. I did not mention the marks. When I lowered the radio, the forest felt closer somehow. I turned to head back toward the trailhead. A knock sounded directly in front of me. I stopped. Another knock came from the same direction, a little higher up, like it had climbed. My chest tightened. I realized, with a clarity that made my stomach drop, that the sound wasn't moving through the woods. It was staying with me. Matching my position. I took one step back. The knock answered. I took another. Again. I didn't run. Not yet. Running feels like admitting something is chasing you. I walked, slow and deliberate. Every sense stretched thin, every nerve awake. The knocks followed, one at a time, always just close enough to feel personal. By the time I reached the edge of the trail and saw the pale shape of my cruiser through the trees, my hands were shaking. I didn't look back. I didn't stop moving until the door slammed shut and the locks clicked into place. The knocking didn't follow me out of the woods that time. That should have comforted me. It didn't. Because as I drove away, one thought kept repeating, steady and insistent. It knew where I was. I told myself the rest of that day was normal. I filled out the missing persons report with careful handwriting. Name, age, last known location, time, weather conditions, all the small, orderly boxes that make chaos look manageable. I avoided the section labeled notes longer than I needed to, then wrote something safe and empty. No visible signs of distress. Trail ended abruptly. Further search required. I did not write about the marks on the trees. I did not write about the sound. Paper makes things real. And I wasn't ready for that. The search expanded by afternoon. 2 more deputies. A volunteer fire unit. A handful of locals who knew the woods better than anyone had a right to. They moved through the forest with the casual confidence of people who had walked those trails since childhood. I watched them carefully. None of them reacted to the trees. No one flinched. No one paused mid-step. No one tilted their head like they were listening to something that didn't belong. That should have reassured me. Instead, it made me feel isolated in a way I didn't have words for yet. We spread out, calling the man's name. Voices echoed and overlapped. Radios crackled. The woods filled with sound again, broken and human. And still, every so often, I thought I heard it. A knock, just at the edge of hearing. Always when no one else was speaking. Always when my attention drifted. Each time, I told myself it was my imagination. Not real. Real. Not real. We found nothing that day. No body. No blood. No torn clothing. No clear trail leading off into deeper woods. As evening settled in, the decision was made to suspend the search until morning. People packed up equipment. Conversations shifted to weather forecasts and logistics. The forest seemed to relax as the noise faded, as though it had been holding its breath. I stayed behind longer than the others. I don't know why. Maybe I didn't want to go home yet. Maybe I was waiting for something to happen now that we were alone again. The light thinned to a gray haze between the trunks. Shadows stretched. Depth returned to the spaces daylight had flattened. I stood near one of the marked trees, staring at the indentation in the bark. Up close, it looked older than I'd first thought. The edges worn smooth, as if struck many times over many years. I pressed my palm against it. The wood was cool, slightly damp. I pulled my hand away quickly, unsettled by the sudden thought that it felt warmer than the surrounding bark. That was when I noticed the pattern. The marks weren't random circles. They followed a vertical line, staggered slightly, climbing the trunk. Chest height. Shoulder height. Above my reach, like something tall had been knocking as it moved. I took a step back. The forest was quiet again. Too quiet. I listened. Nothing. I exhaled, longer than I realized I'd been holding my breath, and turned toward my cruiser. Halfway there, I heard it. One knock. It came from behind me. I froze. This wasn't the faint, distant sound from before. This was close enough that I felt it in my chest. A dull vibration through the air. I did not turn around. Another knock followed, from the same place. Same rhythm. Same tone. I stood there, staring at the path ahead, every instinct screaming at me to move, to run, to get out of the trees. Instead, I did something worse. I listened. The silence between knocks stretched, heavy and deliberate. I became acutely aware of my own breathing, the soft shift of my weight, the faint rustle of fabric as I swallowed. Then, somewhere off to my left, a knock answered. Then another to my right. They weren't surrounding me yet. They were spacing themselves. I raised my radio slowly, careful not to make any sudden movements. My thumb hovered over the transmit button. Before I could press it, the knocking stopped. All at once, the forest held still. I stood there for a long moment, heart pounding, waiting for it to start again. It didn't. I made it back to the cruiser without incident. Drove back to town as the sky darkened, headlights cutting tunnels through the growing night. At home, I checked the trees at the edge of my property before I went inside. Nothing. No sound. No movement. I slept a little that night. Not much. Enough to dream. In the dream, I was standing in the woods again. Only this time the trees were closer together, pressing in. Their trunks were covered in marks, thousands of them, overlapping and layered. I realized, in the dream, that the knocking wasn't coming from outside anymore. It was coming from inside the wood. I woke up with my heart racing and the echo of that sound still ringing in my ears. The next morning, the sheriff called me into his office. He had a look on his face I didn't like. tired, tight. The kind of expression that comes with bad news you don't want to say out loud. They'd found something overnight, not the man, just his phone. It was lying at the base of a tree, screen cracked, battery dead. No signs of damage beyond that. No mud, no blood. The tree it rested against had fresh marks on the bark. The sheriff slid the evidence photo across the desk toward me. I stared at it longer than was professional. Same height, same shape, same clean-edged indentations. I felt the room tilt slightly. "When was this taken?" I asked. "Early this morning," he said. "Before sunrise." I nodded, forcing myself to look away. "We'll keep searching," he said. But his voice lacked conviction. I left the office with a weight settling in my chest. That afternoon, I drove back toward the woods alone. I told myself I was checking the perimeter. I told myself I needed another look at the area. I told myself it was my job. The truth was simpler and harder to admit. I needed to know if it would happen again. The sun was low when I reached the trailhead. Long shadows stretched across the ground. The forest looked darker than it had any right to be. I stepped out of the cruiser and stood there, listening. For a long time, there was nothing. Then, softly, from somewhere deep among the trees, a single knock sounded. Not real. Real. Not real. I didn't answer. I didn't move. I just listened as the sound repeated, slow and patient, like it had all the time in the world. And I understood then, with a creeping certainty that made my skin prickle, that the woods were not trying to scare me. They were waiting. By the third day, the search had become something else. It was still called a search, officially. That's what the form said. That's what the radios repeated. But the tone had shifted. The urgency was gone, replaced by procedure and habit. People moved through the woods because they were supposed to, not because they expected to find anyone. I felt it in the way voices sounded flatter, in the way boots dragged, in the way no one asked anymore what we thought had happened. Missing persons cases in Frost Hollow rarely ended cleanly. The woods took people sometimes. Everyone knew that. Hunters who slipped on wet rock, hikers who underestimated distance, drunks who wandered off the road and never found their way back. But this felt different. I went back through old files that morning. Not because anyone told me to, because I couldn't stop myself. I pulled reports from the last 20 years. Missing hikers. Unsolved disappearances. Cases closed with vague conclusions and no remains recovered. A pattern emerged slowly, the way bad truths usually do. Same general areas, same time of year, same absence of evidence. And scattered through the paperwork, phrases that didn't quite belong. Unusual sounds reported by searchers. Possible auditory hallucinations. Wildlife interference likely. Always dismissed. Always minimized. And always followed, within a year or two, by another disappearance. I closed the file drawer and sat there longer than necessary, listening to the station's old clock tick. Not real. Real. Not real. That afternoon, I drove out alone again. I told dispatch I was doing a perimeter check. I parked farther down the road this time, closer to where the phone had been found. The forest greeted me with silence. No knocks at first. I almost laughed with relief. Almost. I stepped onto the trail and followed it until it narrowed, until the undergrowth thickened and the light thinned to a dull green-gray. The deeper I went, the more I became aware of how alone I was. Not just physically, conceptually. Like I'd stepped into a place where the rules I relied on had loosened. That was when I heard the first knock. Far off. Distant, so faint I might have missed it if I hadn't been waiting. I stopped walking. The sound came again. Same place. I didn't call out this time. I moved toward it instead. Each step felt heavier than the last. The ground sloped gently downward, leading me into a shallow depression where the trees grew tighter together. Their trunks leaned inward slightly, crowding the space. The knock came again. Closer, now. I shone my flashlight ahead, even though it was still daylight. The beam caught on bark and leaves, on nothing that should have made that sound. As I advanced, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. The marks on the trees were fresher here. Sharp-edged, pale where bark had been disturbed recently. Some still oozed sap that glistened faintly in the weak light. I raised my hand, not to touch this time, but to measure height. One mark was well above my head. Another, lower down, sat at about shoulder level. They formed a rough path. I followed it. With each step, the knocking grew more frequent, not faster, just more present, as if the distance between each sound and my body was shrinking. Then, without warning, it stopped. The silence that followed was oppressive. My ears rang with it. I realized how tense I'd become only when my muscles began to ache. I took another step. Nothing. Another. Still nothing. I exhaled slowly, trying to calm the frantic edge creeping into my thoughts. That was when the knock came from directly above me. I looked up. The canopy was dense, branches interlaced high overhead. No movement, no shapes I could identify, just darkness between needles. Another knock sounded, higher still, like it had traveled upward through the branches. Then another, off to my right. Then another, to my left. They weren't random anymore. They were communicating. I backed up until my heel struck something solid. I looked down. It was a tree stump, old and rotted, its top hollowed out like a bowl. As I stared at it, a horrible realization crept in. The interior surface was covered in marks. Hundreds of them, layered over each other, some old and darkened, some fresh and pale. All the same shape, all the same size. This wasn't a single event. This had been happening for a long time. My radio crackled suddenly, loud enough to make me flinch. Dispatch asked for a status update. I opened my mouth to answer and froze. Because beneath the static, faint but unmistakable, I heard it. A knock, coming through the radio. I lowered it slowly, staring at the device like it had betrayed me. The knocking continued, distorted by interference, overlapping with the hiss of static. Not loud, not aggressive, persistent. I shut the radio off. The forest felt closer immediately, like it approved. Not real. Real. Not real. I realized then that I was breathing too fast. I forced myself to slow it down, to think clearly. Whatever this was, it reacted to attention, to movement, to sound. I stood perfectly still. The knocking stopped. I waited. Minutes passed. Sweat cooled on my skin. My legs trembled with the effort of remaining motionless. Nothing happened. I took one careful step backward. A knock answered immediately, close enough that I felt it in my teeth. I swallowed hard. This time, instead of retreating, I did something that still wakes me up at night. I stepped forward. The sound shifted instantly, moving deeper into the trees, just out of reach. Not fleeing, leading. I followed. The path of marks guided me like breadcrumbs. The light dimmed further as the canopy thickened. My sense of direction began to slip, landmarks blurring together. At some point, I realized I could no longer hear the road. No distant traffic, no wind, just my own footsteps and the occasional deliberate knock ahead of me. Then, I saw it. A jacket, caught on a low branch. The missing man's jacket. It hung there neatly, sleeves dangling, fabric clean. Too clean for something that had been lost in the woods for days. I approached slowly. As my fingers brushed the fabric, a knock sounded directly behind me. I turned. Nothing. When I looked back, the jacket was gone. The branch was bare. My heart slammed against my ribs. I staggered back, spinning in place, scanning the trees wildly. The knocking erupted around me then. Not loud, not frantic, just everywhere. From trunks, from branches, from the hollow spaces between roots, from above and below, and all around. I clapped my hands over my ears, but it didn't help. The sound wasn't traveling through the air anymore. It was inside my head. Not real. Real. Not real. I don't remember how I got out of the woods that day. I don't remember finding the trail again or reaching my cruiser. What I do remember is sitting in the driver's seat long after dark, hands shaking on the wheel, listening to the quiet and realizing, with a sickening certainty, that the silence felt wrong now. Like something was missing. After that day, I stopped trusting my memory. Not all at once. Not in any dramatic way. It started with small things. Details that didn't line up. Moments that felt smudged, like fingerprints on glass. I couldn't remember which route I'd taken out of the woods. I couldn't remember turning the key in the ignition. I couldn't remember if I'd shut the radio off myself, or if it had gone quiet on its own. What I did remember was the sound. Even in town, even surrounded by people and engines and voices, I found myself listening for it. Waiting for the hollow tap that didn't belong anywhere. The knocking didn't follow me openly anymore. It did something worse. It hid. At the station, I caught myself pausing mid-conversation, head tilted slightly, as if I'd almost heard something through the walls. At the grocery store, I flinched when a customer rapped their knuckles against the freezer door to get an employee's attention. At home, the tick of cooling pipes made my skin crawl. Not real. Real. Not real. Sleep became unreliable. When I did manage it, my dreams were filled with repetition. The same stretch of trees, the same marks, the same sense of being led somewhere I didn't want to go but couldn't refuse. On the fourth night, I woke to the sound of knocking. I lay still in bed, heart pounding, counting my breaths. It wasn't coming from the door. It wasn't coming from the walls. It was coming from the window. Soft, careful, measured. 3 knocks evenly spaced. I did not move. The knocking came again, identical to the first. No impatience, no force, just persistence. I squeezed my eyes shut and told myself it was a branch brushing the glass. The wind, temperature changes, anything that didn't involve what my body already knew. Not real. Real. Not real. I rolled onto my side, turning my back to the window. The knocking stopped. Relief flooded me so suddenly, it left me weak. Then, directly behind my head, from the wall above my bed, a single knock sounded. I sat up so fast I nearly fell out of bed. The room was empty. Moonlight spilled across the floor. The walls were bare. No pipes ran through that section of the house. No explanation fit. I didn't sleep again that night. The next morning I found marks on the siding beneath the bedroom window. Small, rounded, clean edge, too deliberate to ignore. I called in sick for the first time in years. I spent the day sitting in my living room, blinds half closed, listening to the ordinary sounds of the house. The refrigerator cycling, the clock ticking, cars passing on the road outside. Every sound felt suspect. I tried to ground myself in facts. I wrote things down. Time, place, what I heard, what I didn't hear. The act of recording felt like an anchor, something solid to hold on to. But when I read back what I'd written, parts of it didn't look like my handwriting. That was the moment I truly felt afraid. Not the sharp fear of being followed, not the instinctive panic of the woods closing in. This was quieter, colder. I drove back to the edge of Frost Hollow that afternoon, against every instinct telling me not to. I parked near the same stretch of trees bordering my property. The forest looked unchanged. Ordinary, harmless. I stood at the tree line and listened. Nothing. Minutes passed. My pulse slowed. I almost laughed again, the sound catching in my throat. Then, faintly, from somewhere deep among the trunks, A knock answered my presence. I didn't step forward this time. I didn't speak. I waited. Another knock followed, closer, then another. I realized, with a slow, sinking dread, that it was no longer trying to lead me anywhere. It already knew where I was supposed to be. I backed away, step by careful step, until the trees were at my back fence, and no closer. The knocking stopped immediately, like a switch had been flipped. That night, I dreamed I was standing in the woods again. Only this time, there were no trees, just tall, hollow shapes where they should have been, and from inside each one, something knocked. When I woke, my hands were sore. I looked down and found my knuckles bruised, skin split in places, as if I'd been striking something hard in my sleep. I don't remember doing it, but the pattern of the bruises was familiar. Not real. Real. Not real. I started to understand then that whatever was happening wasn't just around me anymore. It was learning me. I stopped going into the woods after that. Not officially. I didn't request reassignment or make a show of it. I just found reasons to stay closer to town. Paperwork, welfare checks, traffic calls, anything that kept trees at a distance. It didn't matter. The knocking no longer needed the forest. It began showing up in places that should have been safe, familiar, defined by walls and corners and right angles, places where sound behaved the way it was supposed to. I heard it first at the station. Late afternoon. Quiet shift. Phones idle. The hum of fluorescent lights settling into a steady rhythm overhead. I was alone at my desk, reviewing old case notes, when a single knock echoed down the hallway. Sharp. Hollow. It came from the evidence room. I froze, pen hovering over the page. No one else was on that side of the building. I knew that. I'd watched them leave. I'd heard the doors close. The knock came again. Same tone, same spacing. I stood slowly, chair legs scraping too loudly against the floor. The sound made my skin prickle, as if the building itself didn't approve of the noise. I walked down the hallway, each step deliberate. The walls felt closer than usual. The air smelled faintly of dust and old paper. I stopped outside the evidence room door. Another knock sounded. This time, it came from inside. I did not reach for the handle. I stood there, heart pounding, listening as the sound repeated, steady and patient, like it had all the time in the world. Not real. Real. Not real. When it finally stopped, the silence left behind felt thick and heavy, like pressure building behind my ears. I backed away without turning my back on the door. That night I reviewed the missing persons files again, not just the recent ones. All of them. I spread the papers across my kitchen table, overlapping timelines and locations. A pattern emerged that I hadn't seen before. Every disappearance was preceded by a report of unusual sounds. Not always knocking, sometimes tapping, sometimes thuds, sometimes described vaguely as wood-on-wood contact, and in several cases, the responding officer had noted feeling disoriented, distracted, drawn off routine paths. One name appeared more than once. Mine. My stomach dropped as I realized what I was looking at. Years ago, early in my career, I'd responded to a call near the same stretch of woods. A noise complaint. Someone reported strange sounds at night. I'd written it off as animals and weather, filed it, forgotten it. But the report was there. And the notes were longer than I remembered writing. They described knocking. They described marks on trees. They described a sense of being watched. The handwriting was unmistakably mine. The date made my hands shake. It was from 8 years ago. I had no memory of it. Not real. Real. Not real. That night, I didn't turn the lights off when I went to bed. It didn't help. Sometime after midnight, the knocking returned. Not at the window this time. From the closet. soft, deliberate, measured. I sat up in bed, staring at the closed door across the room. The handle didn't move. The door didn't shake. The sound came from the wood itself. Knock, pause, knock. I whispered for it to stop. The sound answered immediately. Closer. I slid out of bed and back toward the wall, eyes never leaving the closet door. My breath came shallow and fast. The knocking shifted then. It began traveling. From the closet to the wall. From the wall to the headboard. From the headboard to the floor. Always following me. Always just behind where I stood. I realized then that it wasn't trying to get into the room. It already was. The knocking stopped when I did. I stood perfectly still, muscles burning, heart pounding so hard I was sure it would give me away. Minutes passed. Nothing happened. I took one careful step toward the door. A knock answered from the wall beside my head. I flinched and stumbled back. That was when I heard it. A sound that wasn't knocking. A sound like wood stretching. Like something inside the walls adjusting itself. Not real. Real. Not real. I don't remember leaving the house. I remember standing on the porch, barefoot, staring at the trees across the yard. The night was still. The air heavy from the forest edge. A single knock answered my presence. I knew then, with a clarity that felt almost calm, that this wasn't a haunting. It was a process. And I was somewhere near the middle of it. I stopped fighting it after that. Not in a dramatic way. I didn't give in. I didn't accept anything. I just stopped resisting. There's a difference, even if it doesn't sound like one. Resistance requires energy, attention, a constant bracing against something you believe you can still keep out. I didn't believe that anymore. The knocking became part of the rhythm of my days. Not constant. Not predictable. It showed up when it wanted to, in places that made no sense. The side of a filing cabinet. The underside of my desk. The wooden frame of the cruiser door while I was driving. Always wood. Always hollow. Always deliberate. I tested it once. I don't know why I did. Maybe curiosity. Maybe exhaustion. Maybe some small broken part of me wanted confirmation that I wasn't imagining everything. I knocked back just once. I used my knuckle against the kitchen table. Soft. Careful. Almost apologetic. The response came immediately. Not from the table. From the wall behind me. Same tone. Same force. Same spacing. My breath caught in my throat. I didn't move. I didn't knock again. The sound didn't repeat. It didn't need to. After that, I noticed the changes in myself. My patrol routes shortened without me meaning them to. My reports grew less detailed. My handwriting shifted, becoming more angular, more deliberate. I caught myself standing too close to trees when I stopped the cruiser, drawn toward their trunks without realizing why. Once, during a routine traffic stop, I rested my hand against a wooden fence while I spoke to the driver. The knocking started beneath my palm, faint but unmistakable. The driver didn't react. I pulled my hand away like I'd been burned. Not real. Real. Not real. I tried to talk to someone about it. Not directly. Not by naming it. I asked the sheriff if he'd ever heard of strange sound complaints going back years. I asked if there were places in the county he avoided at night. He looked at me for a long moment before answering. Some places don't need reasons, he said. Then he changed the subject. I started to wonder how many others had heard it. How many had learned, like I was learning, not to talk about it. The missing man was never found. The search was called off quietly. Another name added to the list. Another set of papers filed away. Life in Frost Hollow continued, as it always did, slow and indifferent. But the woods felt different now. Closer. I felt it when I drove past them. A subtle pressure behind my eyes. A faint awareness, like someone standing just out of sight. The knocking began to change. It wasn't just following me anymore. It was anticipating me. I'd reach for a door, and the knock would come from the frame before my hand touched it. I'd lean against a wall, and the sound would answer where my shoulder was about to rest. It knew my movements. Worse, it knew my pauses. One night, sitting alone in the living room, I realized the knocking hadn't happened in hours. The absence felt wrong, like a held breath. I waited. Nothing. Minutes passed. Then, very slowly, I became aware of a sensation in my hands, a pressure behind my knuckles, an urge. I clenched my fists and forced them to my sides. The knocking came anyway, from inside my chest. Not loud, not external, just a dull, hollow tap that vibrated through my ribs. I pressed my palm flat against my sternum, heart racing. The sound answered. I don't know how long I sat there, frozen, listening to my own body betray me. After that, the boundaries began to blur. I found marks on my forearms one morning, small bruises, rounded, arranged in a pattern that made my stomach turn. I couldn't remember how they got there. I couldn't remember sleeping. I started waking up standing in rooms I hadn't gone to bed in. The garage. The hallway. Once at the back door, hand resting against the wood, knuckles sore. The knocking was softer then. Satisfied. Not real. Real. Not real. The final report broke something in me. I found it in the station archives, misfiled under noise complaints. An old deputy's account, written decades ago. He described hearing knocking from the trees, described marks on bark, described a sense of being chosen. The report ended abruptly, no conclusion, no signature, just a note in the margin, written in a different hand. He stopped answering. I understood then what the process was. It wasn't about taking people, it was about replacing something. Sound fades, wood rots, forests change, but patterns endure. The knocking needed a source, a constant one. I went home early that day, packed nothing, left the lights on. I didn't bother locking the door. At the edge of my yard, I stopped and looked back at the house. It felt smaller than it used to. Temporary. The trees waited beyond the fence, dark and patient. I didn't step toward them. I didn't need to. The knocking began around me, slow and familiar, answering my presence like an old habit. And for the first time, I didn't flinch. I don't remember deciding to record this. That's important. If you're listening to this now, you should know that I don't recall sitting down, pressing a button, or choosing words. I only know that at some point, I realized my voice was already going, steady and low, like it had been doing this longer than I had. The recorder was on the table. Wooden. That matters more than it should. I'm not in Frost Hollow anymore. At least, I don't think I am. The signs changed. The roads stretched. The trees thinned out for a while and then returned, denser than before. I stopped paying attention to names. Names are for places that want to be remembered. Where I am now, the woods come right up to the house. There's no clean line like there used to be. No fence. No yard, just trunks and shadow and the suggestion of depth where depth shouldn't exist. At night, I leave the lights off. Not because it helps. Because it doesn't matter. The knocking doesn't come from outside anymore. Not exactly. It comes from places that don't have distance attached to them. The back of my thoughts. The pause between breaths. The space just before sleep takes over. Sometimes it's faint enough that I can pretend it's my pulse. Sometimes it's not. I've tried leaving again. Packing up. Driving until the gas needle drops too low for comfort. It never works. Roads curve when I don't remember them curving. Turns repeat. Mile markers feel familiar in a way that makes my stomach tighten. Not real. Real. Not real. I always end up back here. The house has started to change. Not visibly. Not in ways I can point to if someone asked. But doors feel heavier. Floors answer my steps with a duller sound. When the wind blows, the walls respond a beat too late, like they're learning when they're supposed to move. There are marks now, on the inside. I notice them first along the doorframe. Small, shallow indentations at about chest height, then more, climbing upward, disappearing near the ceiling where I can't quite see them unless the light hits right. I don't touch them anymore. The last time I did, the knocking started in my teeth. I've stopped sleeping in the bedroom. The walls are thinner there. Or maybe I am. I sit in the main room instead, back against the farthest wall from the trees, recorder on the table in front of me. It knocks sometimes. Not loudly, just enough to let me know it's listening. I tried not to answer it first. That was the rule once. Don't answer it. Don't acknowledge it. Don't make it real. But silence is a kind of answer too. I've learned that. When I don't speak for too long, the knocking changes. It becomes slower, more deliberate. It starts filling the gaps I leave behind. Pauses, blanks, the spaces where words should be. If I talk, it settles. That's why this is still going. I don't know what happens when I stop. There are moments now when I feel hollow, like something has been carved out and smoothed over. I catch my reflection in dark windows and don't recognize the way I'm standing. Too still, too straight. Like I'm waiting for pressure. My hands ache, most of the time. A deep soreness in the knuckles. Sometimes I wake up with flecks of bark under my nails. I don't remember going outside. The trees are closer than they were yesterday. I'm sure of it. They don't rush. They don't need to. Time behaves differently around them. Always has. Rings inside trunks don't count the way years do. They mark repetition, growth, pressure, endurance. I think that's what this is about. Not punishment, not hunger, continuation. Sound needs a source. Patterns need a place to settle. The woods have always known that. Long before roads, long before badges and reports and names written in ink that fades. I wasn't chosen because I was special. I was chosen because I listened. If you're hearing this and thinking you've heard something like it before, I need you to be honest with yourself. That faint tapping you dismissed, that knock you couldn't place, that moment you paused, head tilted, certain something had just brushed the edge of your attention. That's how it starts. Not with fear, with recognition. The recorder is knocking now. Soft. Patient. I don't remember starting this, and I don't remember how much time has passed. The room feels deeper than it should. The walls answer each other when the sound moves. If this cuts off suddenly, it's not because something happened. It's because something finished. I'm going to leave the recorder here. On the table. It likes the table. If you're still listening. If the silence after this feels heavier than it should, I want you to do one thing for me. Listen. Not for something loud. Not for something obvious. Just listen for the sound of wood answering wood. Because once you notice it, once you separate it from everything else, it doesn't need the forest anymore. It just needs a place to continue. Not real. Real. Not real.